Hello
Hey,
there, Steve. How are
nice to
you?
see you again. It must be
Very
a
nice.
year since we last spoke.
Yes, yes, and you're looking very nice and colourful again.
Oh, good. Thank you. Managed to maintain that part of my life, even if everything else went a bit strange.
Have things been very strange over the past year? Well, I can imagine it.
I mean, I've spent virtually all of my time in here, has
Mhm.
been the main difference. And it's only when I've started sort of going out again and I've been up into London a few times, I've realized how much of a limiting routine that is, even though I had great fun in here.
Yes.
It's sort of only when you get the contrast of something different do you realize it. So
I suppose location has a big impact on our story, doesn't it?
it does because and also in terms of creativity for stimulation. And I'm always, I mean, it's an advantage and a disadvantage. I'm always getting bombarded by sensory information, which is terrible if I'm trying to not get bombarded.
Mhm.
But if you're getting bombarded by the same stimuli all of the time, it does sort of limit you a bit,
Mm.
really.
Yes.
But I'm lucky because I'm near like woods and forests and stuff, so I can go running and dog walking. Um, but I've missed London, really, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
How about you?
Well, I've been working mostly from home over the
Yeah.
last 18 months, and going out to the supermarket is quite a novelty these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the thing, you see. It's like we do get a lot of stimuli, but if all of the impact that we have is online, there is so much that we are not including in our story
Yeah.
in terms of smells. Like
Yeah.
what are the things that we're smelling on a daily basis? What are the things that we are um, in the fresh air as opposed to kind of like
Yeah.
being indoors all the time. So
Yeah.
all of
Well, and
that.
there's the relate spaces relational as well. I've run one face-to-face workshop since sort of restrictions lifted, and I was exhausted by it. Was one thing I noticed. But the other thing is you don't get that same relational space. The space doesn't hold the same meaning online because the distance between you and I doesn't really make sense. It's like between me and my screen. But when you're in the room, every tiny little thing adds to that story of that moment, doesn't it?
It does. And I suppose that we have our own stories, our own realities. And then there's the story of those that we're interacting with. And then there is that bigger story. And when we're online, we don't really know what that bigger story is that we're all a
Yeah.
part of that unites us.
I mean, there is the opposite is also true, I think. No, I absolutely agree. What I've loved about online though is you get a peek into people's lives as well, don't you? You see their bookshelves, you see their dog, their kids come in, and it's all of the stuff that, so whilst there is so much missing through working online, it's it sort of humanizes people a bit as long as they don't have a fake background and it's all sterile and that. I love it, like when someone's cat comes and walks across the screen and they apologize and it's no, that's you, that's fully you, that's part of your story, that's part of who you are. So
Yeah.
it's, I think that's been one of the little things that I've liked about it. Is just getting that window more into the whole person and their lives and what their carpet looks like at home and all things like that. Just brings a little bit more color to it. But yeah, there's still a
It
lot. There's
does.
a lot lacking.
It does, but as I think you may agree with me that it all depends on where the camera is pointing, and
Yeah,
we choose where the camera is pointing.
yeah,
So you haven't got a virtual background, but still there is a dimension that I'm allowed to see.
yeah,
And there are those parameters, and behind myself as well. Like there's the kitchen, but I've got the door closed.
yeah. That's true.
So
Yeah,
um, so there's still in a sense, yes, we are intruding in people's lives because I might not want you to see my cat. I don't have a cat,
yeah,
so there is that kind of intrusion, and there is that also that the greater intimacy, but at the same time less intimacy.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think it's full of contradictions, isn't it? I wouldn't want to. It towards the start, I was thinking, oh, it'd be quite nice if I never had to travel again. And then I think many people went through the same thing. I started thinking, actually, no, I think I really would start to mentally deteriorate quite a bit if I if I didn't leave this space. Yeah.
Simply because we're not exposing ourselves to all the different stimuli for the different senses. Like, for example, the smell. It's like I'm only going to be smelling the foods that I cook, and I'm not going to smell the flowers or the grass.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can smell the grass because I'm fortunate enough to have a garden, but
Yeah.
we need more variety, I suppose. And in terms of the stories then, in your professional life at this point in time, how are you constructing your story? Like, what is your personal story? What is your lived experience story? And how does that relate to your work story?
Right. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that, but let me start, and then we'll see where we end up.
Yeah.
Where I'm fascinated with story is the power of story to reveal more of ourselves, I think, and for other people to reveal more of themselves. And I think over the last couple of years, I've just started allowing more spontaneous stories to be part of my work. I mean, a good example of that is typically if I do a conference talk or a keynote or something, at the start there's the bit where I'll tell the story of a couple of projects that I've done to introduce myself and then get on with the talk. And I've always enjoyed that bit the most, and other people have always seemed to have found that bit really interesting. So I created a new talk. When was it? It was last year. It was for a client I was working with, where it's just stories. And it's got a weird title. The talk is called 9 Wonky Projects Interspersed with Thoughts on Creativity and the Human Condition, featuring a bingo machine. And I've got it here. I bought this bingo machine. Mm-hmm. It just has it in there. And I've picked 9 of my favorite projects, such as the Silent Podcast or the Inexpert Conference and things like that. Just weird projects that I did just to see what would happen. And all this talk is I turn the bingo machine, a number comes out, and I tell the story of that project. And there's not enough time to do them all, so the bingo machine randomizes it. And part of me's felt really, really guilty about doing that. It's like, I'm not giving anyone any content here. Part of me thinks, is this really egotistical because I'm just talking about me? But if I bracket those things off, people have responded really well to the talk because it is just storytelling. And it's really easy storytelling because it's just stories about stuff that's gone on in my life. And so I've become fascinated by that. Is just that allowing more of myself to show up in my work. But I think there's a really fine balance with storytelling is if it's forced or deliberate or overly constructed, it has the opposite effect, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. I always say you can tell someone that's been on a storytelling course because they tell these stories in this really weird mechanistic way. But for something to just spontaneously come out, to allow ourselves to just feel into what feels relevant here, and for other people to do that way, I think I'm really interested in all my work being fundamentally relational. And I think the more that stories can naturally emerge in it, the more relational it becomes. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. It does, because for your audience for you to receive good feedback after you've told those stories, then your audience must have seen themselves reflected in the stories that you're telling somehow.
And there's something about stories makes one of the other reasons why I do this strange talk, and I've done it a number of times now. And what's brilliant is it's never the same talk again because the bingo machine decides, and sometimes I put different projects in there. So I like that element of it as well. It doesn't feel I don't like stuff that feels too scripted for me. But the way that I sort of frame that talk is here's a load of stories. It's your job to work out what's relevant. It's your job to work out what's relevant for you, what's of interest to you. I have no idea. I don't have a formula for creativity. And it's exactly as you say, we spot elements of ourselves. It's the wonderful thing of projection, isn't it? As my friend Simon Caviccia describes projection, if you spot it, you've got it. So you spot something in a story, and the connection or the resonance it brings is because it's already part of you. I think that's where it can be so so powerful if it's not overly scripted, I think.
Well, I think it's yeah, the psychoanalysts, they always talk about projection. We project you know, features onto others. They can be good and they can be bad.
Yeah.
You know, so we can somebody's being really kind, and we see that kindness simply because we're kind.
Yeah.
I'll give you like an example of this. It's somebody had done like a charitable act of kindness, and somebody the person kind of like evaluating it said, oh, you know, they're just like, they were trying to make out that this person was a thief,
Right.
you know, that they'd stolen something rather than that they'd actually been very generous. So they distorted what had
Yeah.
happened. Okay, they distort, and the reason that that person had distorted what had happened is because they themselves were a thief. So
Right. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
make judgments based on, like, you know, if that thief who was making the judgment, if they had done that, they would have seen that, you know, that would have been part of their, you know, their manipulation.
Yeah.
And so they could only see from their own level. Isn't that
Yeah.
amazing? Yeah.
It's because I guess you can't recognize something if you don't know what it is in yourself. And it's really difficult to allow yourself to sort of admit to that. I remember I did art foundation in art therapy a few years ago. I think it was that, or it might have been some Gestalt training. We was doing some stuff around projection, and the exercise was to pick someone in the room and write some descriptions about them. Is that I think we had to write down they are and a number of descriptions. And I picked this guy that was, I just found him quite creepy. So I wrote down, he is creepy, he is slimy, he is all of these things. And I didn't know him. He's just, there was something about him that made me think that. And the next part of the exercise, in the next column, you wrote down, I have the capacity to be creepy. I have the capacity to be slimy. And of course I'm going, no, of course I'm a nice guy. I'm not like that. But if you really reflect on it, of course you do. Absolutely you do. Otherwise you wouldn't recognize it in the other one. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you choose to be or you are. But that, I think that's so important. And I think in story, that just allows that projection and that transference and to see more of yourself in the story as well. And I think it's the same with my artwork. Basically, I've lived off of Instagram because a lot of consulting work and speaking work's gone. But the more honest I've been in artwork, the more other people have seen stuff in it. And it's either touched them or they've commented on it or they've wanted to buy it. And again, that's counterintuitive for me. But I think there's storytelling beyond words as well. You can tell stories in movement, in pictures, in the abstract as well.
In symbols as well.
Yeah.
That's right. And I suppose it's the power of truth or something which is real in those images or in those symbols that resonates and you know, causes a stimulus so that people feel touched by it.
Yeah. Well, I've started to think, and I've learned this through art over the last couple of years, is there's more power in the abstract than there is in the concrete, or more power for transformation in the abstract than the concrete. Because there was a piece that I did, I'm going to contradict myself now, but typically so I'll use this example. There was a piece that I did early last year, I think, and it was a paper cutting, and it was of two figures. One was bigger than the other just because I did the paper cutting wrong. And the smaller figure had its finger over the other person's mouth and it said, "Shh, I didn't ask for help." And I made that because I was getting lots of help that I didn't request from my in-laws about how to cope with COVID. And it's like, I really, there's something about unhelpful help or unsolicited advice that I really dislike. I like help, I'll ask for help. So I did this paper cutting and I put it on Instagram. And even though it had words in it, it didn't say what it was about. And it had such a weird reaction. Lots of people said, I can totally relate to this. And then there was lots of comments saying, what is all this feminist bullshit you're posting? It's like, okay, that's interesting. That's not what it's about. And then someone else sent me a direct message and said, oh no, that was it. Someone commented and said, oh great, so I have to get consent for offering advice now. And again, I just thought that artwork didn't say any of that, but it left enough space for people to project into it whatever was going on for them. And some of it was solidarity, some of it was anger, some of it was projecting all sorts of things. And again, that's where if stories, they don't necessarily need to be literal. The more space in them, I guess it invites us to make whatever sense of it that we need to.
That's right. That is the privilege, isn't it, of stories, is that everyone is allowed to interpret the story according to their own experience, according to their own interest, I suppose. Yeah.
I was listening to a philosophy podcast a few months ago, and it's one of these things that it may be obvious to you, and it was obvious to me, but I thought I've never thought of it. It was only when the Gutenberg press, so the printing press, was invented, that really stories could exist outside of the storyteller, or thought could exist, that you could just then have a pen name and put thought out there and it could exist. I mean, we're so used to it now with social media. And I guess something was lost in the mystery of storytelling, or the fact that it was inherited and inevitably changed. And I guess that's a similar thing, isn't it? The more repeatable, absolutely repeatable the printing press made it, the more absolutely repeatable the internet and social media makes it. It alters the story in that way, where some of that magic and mystery, where its amorphous, changes.
Well, in the olden days, like before the printing press, when somebody told you a story, you didn't need to ask, well, who's telling that story? Whereas with the written stories, that's the question. We're bombarded with stories on a daily basis, and we have to question ourselves on who is saying this story? What is this? What is the purpose of this story? And we don't know. It's not clear because we don't know who's telling that story. And so it's not a story that's been handed down from generations. So like, before the printing press, those stories were handed down through generations, and people interpreted them based on the actual context. Whereas now we've got stories, we may be reading stories that were written 100 years ago, by the Brontes, like more than 100 years ago. And who knows what their real intention was in telling those stories. We don't know their intention. We only know our intention in reading them and interpreting them.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's, I guess, in some of those original sort of folk stories and things like that, there'd be the voice, there'd be the look of the person telling the story, there'd be the situation, the environment, is the person alone, what's the pathos they're putting into it, and all of those things are missing. So it's not to make it wrong that we have written stories, but it changes, doesn't it? And it makes me wonder how much technology enables storytelling and also constrains it in certain ways as well.
And I suppose the stories that we don't hear, it's as though those realities don't exist for us. For example, yesterday, like there's the crisis in Belarus, and the president of Belarus was on TV saying, well, he doesn't like England very much at all. He likes to put it mildly. And he says, for 1,000 years, we didn't know you exist, and we don't want to know now. And when he said for 1,000 years, we didn't know you exist, it's like, it reminded me like, well, for 1,000 years, a country just doesn't exist for another country. The stories are not relevant, for that period of 1,000 years. It's like, and there are countries that for us, they don't exist because we don't hear stories about them. For example, on the news, it was like the fires in Greece, but there are fires in Turkey as well, but we don't hear those stories. And so when we don't hear the stories, it's as though that reality doesn't exist because we haven't heard that story.
It's there's sort of, I think there's a joint responsibility. I'm making this up so as I go along because it's just coming to mind. There's almost like a joint responsibility for the storyteller, but also for the listener, isn't there? The listener to seek diverse stories. And it's one thing in thinking of diversity in all of its elements. Is there's one thing to invite diversity in, but I also think there's a big responsibility to seek it, to be responsible to hear those voices.
Yeah, I mean, for example, now with the COVID pandemic, again talking about stories that we didn't learn, we were not told, and therefore that reality didn't exist. 100 years ago, when there was the pandemic previously, after the First World War, it wiped out 12 million Indians. It wiped out villages because Indian soldiers, 1.4 million, fought in the First World War, and they caught the virus, like, as you know, from Europe, and went back home to India and just, you know, disseminated. And why don't we hear the story? That was 12 million people that died of that. And well, we don't hear that story because the storytellers, it doesn't promote their cause, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
You see? Like, you know, we were colonized at that point, and so obviously it wasn't managed very well, because otherwise how would 12 million people have just died? It wasn't managed very well. So that story of the story even of 1.4 million soldiers fighting in the First World War, that was just the Indians. What about the other Commonwealth countries? But we don't hear their stories because it weakens the narrative of, you know, of a.
Well, I guess there's so many elements. There's the sort of, it's not pure, but I describe it as pure. There's that pure storytelling, which is just of you and I in this moment sharing an experience, so talking from our own experience of stuff that's happened to us or we've witnessed. But then there's also a political dimension of story, isn't there? There's an ethical dimension of stories. There's a manipulative dimension of stories. And this is where I'm always curious about organizations that suddenly become interested in storytelling as a thing. And I always think that that's already getting off on the wrong foot. Because again, a similar thing. I mean, it's obviously not as abhorrent and terrible an impact as what you've just described, but really the organization will only want stories that support its narrative or its objective. It won't want the stories it won't want the wonky stories. It won't want the stories that are counterpoint stories and all of those things. And I think that also just speaks to the power of stories. It's the same with creativity in general, I think. And it's just, the older I've got, I've thought there is a real vested interest, isn't there, of those in positions of power to suppress individual creativity to maintain the status quo. I mean, that's not a new thing. I'm just starting to realize it more personally. And so, I mean, it's the same in revolutions, isn't it? It's the storytellers, the orators, the artists, the poets are the ones that are locked up, not because that's scary. It's like they work in these mysterious ways. So I think that political side of it, as terrible and as unpleasant as it is more evidence of the power of that storytelling, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, so stories can be used for so many different things. Stories can be used for learning. Stories can be used for persuasion, for, you know, and that persuasion can be simply a business kind of persuasion, like branding. You know, you tell a story so that you get customers, you get buy-in, and politics. And stories can be like, think about family stories. Our family stories, I don't think we spend as much time as we would perhaps, you know, in the times before TV, when people would at least eat dinner together, they'd have their meals together, and they would tell their stories of, like, even the story about what happened during the day. I don't think people sit down as much as they used to, not 3 times a day. I don't sit down 3 times a day with others, you know, just sharing stories. And so that's what we're missing, aren't we? We're missing these spaces where we just informally just chat and tell each other stories at breakfast, at lunchtime, at dinner time.
You got me really thinking now. It's almost like, as well as the printing press, you think of broadcast media has not only given us less time and an excuse not to, it means that they're genetically modified stories that we're consuming, really, isn't it? It's not the organic home story. And I wonder, I've not traveled the world enough to know, but I wonder if that's particularly present in the West, or at least in established economies. And I wonder if, or I suspect in some places that are less developed, and I'm doing inverted commas because I don't literally think development, we only ever talk about development in reductionist economic terms. I wonder if there still is that tradition. I don't know.
I know that
yeah.
when I was born, when I was growing up, we did used to sit around the fire telling stories.
Yeah.
But that was a long time ago now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think when going back to the Punjab, it was when they got cookers instead of like the open, the cooking, the earthen things that they used to cook on, getting cookers and all these time-saving devices, they took away the time. Even when women used to go out to fetch water, that would be the time when they would talk with each other and tell their stories. Now you just open a tap and it's convenient, but what's the cost of that convenience? The cost of that convenience is the loss of the social interaction.
And this is where, again, that relational space that we were speaking about comes into it, because a campfire isn't a magic, or a cooking fire isn't a magic thing that suddenly makes storytelling happen. The configuration is you are in a circle, traditionally, if you're sitting around it, or at least in a different configuration. There's I think the crackle and the flicker of the campfire reduces a certain amount of awkwardness over silence and things. And I guess if you're not cooking on a campfire and you're then facing a wall with a stove, again that's unusual, isn't it? But then I think about my daughter. So my daughter's 14. Typically, it's when we are side by side, say in a car or walking somewhere, that's when more of her stories come out and I learn more about her. So I think that configuration and that space is incredibly important. Because that side-by-side thing can be, I guess, if you're quite shy or quite self-conscious, you can reduce it. But then if you've got a television in front of you, it sort of gives that further reason to not share stories, doesn't it?
Yeah. So in terms of the stories, though, that we hear, depending on who we choose to have conversations with, I suppose the internet enables us to have conversations with a wider variety of people. So we're learning, or we're hearing stories that otherwise we wouldn't be exposed to, because we wouldn't hear those stories because they're not written about.
No.
That's why we wouldn't be exposed to them, because you have to have a conversation with someone to find out those stories.
Yeah. And it's where some mediums, like particularly good podcasts, are good at doing that, of hearing those unheard stories, or even if you're not there, even if you're not there with a person, or giving access to those unknown stories. I think with the podcast, someone can tell their story, but they don't hear the response unless they're doing it live. No, that's true. It's a transmitted thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the advantage that they give is quite often, actually, the more badly produced podcasts are better because they're less constrained and less scripted. But you're right, you don't get that response back. And I think that's the thing with the story, isn't it? You're sharing it and evaluating the response and getting it back. And that's one of the things I found difficult about doing online talks, is because particularly if it's a broadcast and you can't see the faces on the screen, you've no idea if everyone's gone or they're bored or they're laughing or they're smiling. But yeah, I guess it gets back down to that, doesn't it? It's that small collection of people. So not mass thing, small collection of people. There is the gesture and the response. There's the story and the response to the story, and stories triggering stories. There's that brilliant scene in the film Jaws when the three guys are on the boat. I don't know if you've seen the film Jaws from the 70s.
Long time ago.
I mean, it's a classic scene, and One of the reasons why I like the film Jaws is I don't like it because it demonizes sharks, and some of the special effects aren't great. But the three main characters, Brody, Hooper, and Quint, are just so brilliantly played. And there's a bit where it's that they don't quite get on. There's a whole power struggle between them. But there's one evening where they've had a couple of drinks and they're sitting on the boat in the middle of the sea. The shark's not there, and they just start telling stories. And then there's a story, and then there's a story comes from a story, and another story, and then it goes into like a bit of a competitive story, and then there's a moving story. And that's just one of the best film scenes I've seen, because I think some of it was improvised, although it was around the script. And it just showed that relational, small, intimate dynamic of it.
That sounds great. I mean, I feel like watching that film again, just to
Just
watch
for that
the
bit.
scene that you described.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is, for me, it's the power of conversation, the power of discourse,
Yeah.
and the power of conferences. Because I think conferences, they're meant to create a space where novelty can arise. You know,
Yeah.
if you attend a conference and you hear the person saying what they said the year before, well,
Yeah.
that's not the purpose of a
No.
conference. So it has to be new every time, and it has to be relevant,
Yeah.
you know, because if
Yeah.
what we're saying is not relevant to the other, it's a waste of their time getting them to listen to us, basically. So there has to, and that's why I like the conversation rather than a speech.
Yeah.
Because in the past, when I used to go to conferences, I used to prepare speeches, but speeches, it's like, well, they might not be relevant to everyone. They might be relevant to one person. You know, what I'm
Yeah.
saying might be relevant to one or two, but not to the whole masses. And whereas when we're having a conversation like this, we can gauge, you know,
Yeah.
whether the other person is interested in what we're
Yeah. Yeah.
saying and they're not. And there's that feedback loop. I think
Yeah.
stories need to have a feedback loop, don't they?
Well, and I think there's an unquestioned assumption, like systemic unquestioned assumption that doing stuff at scale and growth being the only objective. So it's at scale and growth and big is good. But I think exactly as you said, maybe for economic growth or growing a capitalist business or something, but small and intimate is far more potent. Now, it may not make you as much money and you may not be able to measure it, but I think that's fundamentally part of being human, isn't it? How do you create those intimate spaces? And there's something around I don't go to conferences anymore just because without one, I just thought, I really hate these. Why do I keep going? Because even if a story has an ulterior motive, you can tell, can't you? It's some level, even if you're not consciously aware of it, you can tell if this is a story to make me buy something from someone. So it's those stories that reveal more of us. It's why I probably said last year or the year before, I'm very interested in improvisation and spontaneity. And I did a lot of training with a guy called Keith Johnson, who wrote some books on improvisation in the 80s. And Keith used to say, people don't go to a theatrical improvisation show. When they go, they don't laugh necessarily at the content. Because if you took, and it was not universally true, maybe they do sometimes, but generally, if you took the content of an improvised show, scripted it and performed it as a play or a stand-up, it wouldn't be funny. And Keith said, what endears people is witnessing the good-natured struggle between human beings. And I love that. That's the thing that's endearing, is these two people going, we don't know what's going to happen next, but we're both in it together. And I think that's that intimacy in stories. I mean, we don't have a script for this conversation. I really wouldn't feel engaged if we did. But I love that term of the good-natured struggle, because we're exploring something together live because we're genuinely fascinated by it.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
right. And in doing so, we're delving into the unknown. You know,
Yeah.
there's like, my world is unknown to you and your world is unknown to me, and we're building that bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of mystery then, you know, what is the mystery around stories and creativity that we don't know, that it's important for us to focus on?
There's something in here that I'm not sure if I got the words for. but it's like you cannot pursue storytelling in the same way that you cannot pursue creativity. I often say to people, if you pursue creativity in the way that you're going about it, you want to measure it, scale it, repeat it, roll it out, the moment you achieve that, it will no longer be the thing you was pursuing. I think it's the same with storytelling. It's to intentionally try and go, right, now I'm going to tell a story and it's going to be like this. You're missing the point. It's like the near enemy of storytelling. So I think the mystery is, it is only when it naturally evolves and spontaneously and genuinely involved that it has any potency. And it's like, I can't remember if this was an analogy from Gordon Mackenzie's book, Orbiting a Giant Hairball, but I'll attribute it to him anyway. It's like the floater things you sometimes get in your eye. So you notice something coming across your eye. Sorry, my daughter's just coming to see me. I need to let her know. No, she's got the point. If you try and look at the little floaty things, they go away. The way to make them appear is to not try to look. So I think that's the mystery of storytelling, is to think this is a letting go. It is a relaxing and allowing more of our spontaneous natural selves to emerge in this form. And I think that's the mystery of it. The moment we try and pursue it as if it's some magical beast we're going to capture and then use, we lose it. Does that make sense? I think it's paradoxical, the way we go about it. Yeah. And wouldn't it be terrible if, I mean, I'd hate to be wrong on this, because imagine if we suddenly discovered a formula for storytelling that everyone could repeat ad infinitum. That'd be horrible. So I like the fact that it's something we can never crack. And also to just think of stories can exist without words. Just this philosophical question of the fact that I've not told of an experience I've had, does that mean it's not a story or not? We can experience these things beyond words as well. So I think that's my ramblings around the mystery of it. And I think just let it be mysterious. Don't try and resolve it. We try and resolve mystery. I don't know why. It makes the world less magical. I've got a Nietzsche quote on my wall because I look at it all the time. And I think this speaks a little bit about mystery and the importance of moving towards stuff that doesn't make sense. And Nietzsche said, learning to see the world as strange makes us unhome in the everyday, and thereby restores it as a potential place of wonder. So that's one of the reasons to not try and pin down storytelling. Allow it to be unusual and amorphous and mysterious, because that reclaims wonder and magic in the everyday, I think.
Yeah, that's so true, because this whole thing about identity, values and behaviors, there is so much research, and it seems kind of quite obvious that our behaviors are they're influenced by how we perceive our identity to be. There is like a relationship there. But in terms of the mystery, it's as though there is this invisible hand that is at play, which, you may call it the life force that we can't define. It's intangible, but that life force, like a force of love, for example, the force of passion, that where does our passion come from? It's like, what makes us really passionate about doing X rather than Y, or being in this place rather than that place? So those are the mysterious things. What brings us here right now? It could be, that is the mystery of it. Why here, why now?
And that's I love the way you've expressed that. And it's okay to not know where that comes from. In fact, it's important to not know, I think, because otherwise we reify it and reduce it. It's like people say to me, how do you know what projects to do? How do you know what stuff to do? And it's like, I don't know, and I don't need to know. It just happens. I don't need to know. I don't want to know. There are some things that are important to know, but I don't want to know that. That's part of the mystery. I don't think any other species does that. I don't think my dog's running around thinking, oh God, what does it mean to be a dog? That she's just being a dog. So that's part, I think, that relaxing into that and that being okay. I mean, if you zoom out enough from our here and now experience, or zoom in enough, you get to a point where you think none of us knows what we're doing anyway. you can't get to a point. I mean, people may fill that gap with religion and beliefs, but even with that, you get to a point of thinking, well, I don't know. So if the universal backdrop to being human is not knowing, we may as well get used to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, and there's a really fascinating thing around stories and identity, I think. So as a gestaltist, the sort of gestalt perspective on identity is roughly, my oversimplified version is, our identity is continually constructed at the boundary of me and my environment. So that boundary of my sense of self, your sense of me, the environment, that's a constant thing. So it's identity's a reified word, but it's that constant process of self-identifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the more of myself I let out for a story, the more of your story I hear, and the more of the stories of the world I hear, that just contributes to this dance of identity. Our identity isn't static. It's where I'm not, I either miss the point, or I'm not particularly a big fan of this idea of personal branding. I think it's fine as long as you're renewing your brand every millisecond, then it's probably quite accurate. But yeah, I think that stories really in ways that we might not understand really start to tinker and disrupt and confirm our sense of self, who we are, and our place in the world in relation to others. Okay,
brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Steve. I've really enjoyed my conversation with you, and I'm glad you chose to have this conversation with me. For the past couple of years, I've really appreciated the time that I've spent in discovering, exploring, and just finding out more about your story and how it relates to my story. And
yeah, and it's felt, I feel that I've expended energy and renewed the same amount of energy, and I think that's lovely. Thank you for having me back.
Okay, brilliant, Steve. I'll speak with you very soon. Okay.
Yeah. Cheers then. Bye.
Bye bye.